Okay, well, I'll do a formal welcome. Welcome to the launch of Living God's Future Now. Not that God's Future hadn't already started a little while ago, but this series is called Living God's Future Now. And we're absolutely thrilled to welcome you. This is part of our HeartEdge offering, which has expanded enormously during lockdown. And at some stage late on, I think Ben will share with you some of the other HeartEdge offerings that you can enjoy, and you might want to think about joining HeartEdge yourself and becoming part of this growing movement. I'm absolutely thrilled to say that Walter Brueggemann is going to be our first conversation partner, or my first conversation partner in this series that we're planning to do on the second Thursday of each month till Kingdom Come. Walter, the best thing I can say to introduce Walter is that if I'm preaching on the Old Testament, I'll go and find what he's written on the passage before I go any further, and that's probably true. It's not only true that he will have written on the passage, there's almost no question about that, so it's pretty reliable, but also that it'll be better than what anyone else has said. And it's as simple as that. If you want to know the prestige and the reputation of Walter Brueggemann, that pretty much encapsulates it. He's the first person you go to. But also what, in coming to know Walter over the last 15 years, as I think I just calculated it, the sense of Walter really as a theologian who's a specialist in the Old Testament, I feel is a better identity description than as an Old Testament scholar. And I imagine, Walter, you'd be happy with that description.
Yes, from you, I would take it. So thank you. Thank you for your generous comment. It's great to be with you.
We've done absolutely no preparation for this conversation, which is, I always think, the best way to have conversations. But Walter, I have read a paper that you wrote for the Journal of Preachers about pestilence and its place in the Old Testament. And just to summarize for people, you talk about three kinds of pestilence. You talk about a transactional relationship between God and Israel, where if Israel plays bad, God plays bad towards Israel. And you talk about a mobilizing relationship where God uses the forces of creation to achieve a particular outcome. And also you talked about the kind of the Job version of raw holiness, where you, sunshine, are lowly and you don't get to understand the ways of the raw and holy God. You talked about, do you want to say a bit more about those three categories?
Well, I think it's hazardous to make any connections to our own experience, but as I studied the text, it seemed to me that those were three quite distinct ways of talking, and I think that the Old Testament text makes a big effort to see what happens if you draw pestilence into the world where God rules, which is what they tried to do. So I just thought that was, I regarded those as suggestive probes. It didn't lead me to any conclusions, but I think that's an obligation we have to try to think about the virus now in the context of our faith. Obviously, all of those are pre-scientific ways of reasoning, and we're having, as you know, in the States, we're having a big argument about whether the government should pay any attention to science. So I don't want to accent the pre-scientific, which is not the same as anti-scientific, but that was where my thinking went.
So I was interested, you didn't refer, I mean, I guess on the grounds of pestilence, this is reasonable, but you didn't talk about the exile and whether there was any degree to which Israel's relationship with God changed in the exile.
I've been working on a paper follow-up to that to say that in the exile, the way the text presents it, that God discovered in the exile new waves of compassion about which God didn't know until God saw that Israel was suffering so acutely. So there are not a lot of texts, but there are some texts that show God making a quite fresh move and taking a very fresh initiative as though to start over again. So I think, yes, I think the relationship is is changed during the exile. I think one can see the same thing about the flood narrative in Genesis, that what really changes in the flood narrative is God's inclination toward creation. Nothing changes about creation, but God is at a new place in treating with creation. And I think one can see that happening.
I'm going to try and encourage you again, Walter, to give us the full beard. Yeah, that's great.
You sound like my mother. Sit up straight.
Yeah, that's right. So, Walter, you may not be aware, but those who are part of the HeartEdge world will know that one of the two pillars of HeartEdge theologically is the notion that the exile was the defining period for Israel, in terms of coming to understand an intimacy with God in exile in Babylon that was greater than they'd ever had with land, king, and temple, despite all their privileges, as it were. But you've actually phrased that very differently. You've talked about God discovering a new way to be with, to use my kind of language, to be with Israel. That's a fascinating. I mean, in terms of the ancient unchangingness of God, that doesn't sit terribly well. Could you say a bit more about that?
Well, my way of thinking about that is that the Old Testament doesn't articulate God in ontological terms, but in dramatic terms. So God is a player in an ongoing drama, and if God is a real player, then God has to have the kind of freedom that every actor has in a drama to develop the role, to develop the character, and I think that's what happens. So if the pivotal text for that argument, as you would know, is in Hosea 11, in which God is very angry at Israel. And then right in the middle of the poem, God has a bolt of insight that I don't want to act that way anymore. And every parent knows about that. Every parent knows about discovering in the middle of all of that a very different impulse. And I think that the prophetic poets of Israel hone in on the emergence of that surprising impulse, which I suppose one could say in the literature happens over and over, but no doubt the exile is the primary place where that happens.
I'm going to suggest you sit back on the chair a bit more and take the risk that we can hear you. That's perfect. Right. If you stay there, then we get you in all your glory.
That won't take long.
but I think one or two people might be nervous that if you stretch out your hands to the screen, then you might be about to create Adam.
All right.
So I mean, I this is obviously a stereotype, but people will be interested in that notion of a progression in God's character. Could you continue that trajectory and show, in a sense, in what ways Jesus comes out of a development in God's character?
Well, I wouldn't use the word progression or development. I would just use the word freedom. So it's not a linear getting better and better, but it is the freedom to take new initiatives of self-presentation and self-articulation. And if you do that, then it's easy to see that in Jesus of Nazareth, God takes yet another fresh initiative that we had not witnessed before. But that, to my mind, is very different from the old liberal notion of progression that has within it, as you know, supersessionism.
Yeah.
That in Jesus we've gone beyond Jewishness.
We left the Jews behind. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And this is obviously taking us off scriptural territory, or if you can ever be off scriptural territory. But if could you how does that work post post the book of Revelation? I mean, post the end of Scripture in the early church and then through the history of the church. What sort of ways would you give us of thinking about God's freedom?
Well, it seems to me that one can make the argument that in the ongoing interpretive tradition of the church, that we do get fresh disclosures or fresh insights or fresh revelations that are evoked by particular historical circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
And one doesn't have to argue that those are de novo, completely new, but they are fresh, different alternatives. So if you take Luther, for example, it seems to me that Luther's radical articulation of the grace of God represents something of a novum in our capacity to discern God differently. That doesn't mean that it's not older in the tradition, but it means it's a fresh articulation. And I think that your work about improvisation, for example, was another kind of thing in which, if I understood the way you said that I think you said the fourth act,
mm-hmm.
God's freedom summons us to freedom and imagination as well to do improvisation. And I think that was a decisive moment in our ongoing understanding about this relationship with God that had never been seen quite that way before.
Well, I'm flattered to be up there with Martin Luther, although he's not everybody's cup of tea, but I'll take it. Thank you. Can we move to the virus? Because I think what you've offered us already today is two possible ways to understand the virus. In other words, that the first way I say would be to see it in a sense a little bit like the way I've portrayed Israel in exile, that this is a time to come to a newer understanding of ourselves in relationship to creation, ourselves in relationship to God. That would be one strand, if you like. But what you're offering us is a completely different strand, but a different in quality strand, which is a way of understanding God, God's freedom. Obviously in the back of that, who caused the virus is the kind of theodicy question. But yeah. Could you sort of explore, either or both of those strands, or reflect on the significance of there being more than one way to approach the question?
Well, I am of those two options. I am probably, like most of us, I am more comfortable with the first, and that is that the virus is a summons for us to rethink what it is we are about, and hopefully to be inching toward some new notions of what's normal. So what we're able to see is that Beijing has clean air for the first time without so much pollution. Kids are not getting so sick because they're not going to school to pass sicknesses around. So this is an opportunity to re-examine how we have organized our common life in terms of what I would say is mainly the pursuit of commodities. And what we are discovering is in our quarantines that relationships elementally count more than commodities, and maybe to completely reorient the administration of commodities in our economy. It seems to me all of that gets on the table through this. It's not unrelated to the second way you put that, and that is that the elemental covenantal attributes of God in terms of justice and compassion and mercy and faithfulness become more sharply defining of what it means to be human. Now that may not be a great crisis in Britain, but in the United States, we have long since forgotten that those ways of being human are remote from the dominant ideologies of our society. So I call that in some ways freshly revelatory, even though it's been in front of us all the time.
Mm-hmm. So would you think it was fair to say that the virus more or less intensifies the questions that are pressing on our culture anyway, and perhaps makes them unavoidable? We can't
Yes.
hide from them anymore.
I think that's exactly right. Yes, right.
Yeah. What's the virus showing us about God?
Well, I'm just working on a little essay, but I think it shows us that God can be absent. I think so. I've been working on the whole notion of God forsakenness, and our habit about that is that we are not really God forsaken, but we feel God forsaken. And I want to not make that distinction, saying that when we feel God forsaken, we have to entertain the thought that we are in the moment God forsaken, the way in which Israel in the exile was indeed God forsaken. Mm-hmm. So I'm working on that text that your folks likely know from Isaiah 54, where God says, "For a moment I did forsake you." So I've been thinking about how long a moment is, and it turned out to be a very long time.
Yeah. But of course, that Isaiah 54 comes immediately after Isaiah 53, and I know Isaiah wasn't like you; he didn't write as many books, but he certainly didn't seem to have sat at his desk and just peeled the whole thing off from 1 to 66. Right. It's a bit of a hodgepodge. I don't think that's a disgraceful thing to say,
right.
Although it's not a scholarly term. But leaving all that aside, if you take a canonical view, we read it as 53 followed by 54.
Right.
So 53 is, for Christians, one of the most significant texts in the Old Testament, and but it does give us a picture of a God who responds to suffering, possibly even pestilence, by taking that suffering into God's own person and body.
Right.
Is that a helpful way to think right now?
I think it is a helpful way. I don't know that it is the helpful way. I think Christians want to find out the right fix. And Isaiah certainly is multifaceted, so you can touch it sort of where you want to touch it. But obviously, one can imagine now that God is deep in grief about the suffering and the deaths and the dislocation, as God is wont to be. So I think one could usefully develop that trajectory of thought.
I mean, is it worth pursuing it in a Trinitarian way? Because I saw a painting a day or two ago by a Polish Jesuit that portrayed Jesus as being in the emergency room, surrounded by people trying to put ventilators on him and struggling to breathe in a very incarnate way. And you can I guess see the Holy Spirit at work amongst the care providers of different kinds, and all the people that we clap every Thursday night in Britain for working for the health service, and care workers in amongst care homes and so on. But where does that put God the Father?
Well, one could imagine that the father is right outside in the waiting room in anxious grief
Okay,
over the son. If you play
right.
out the analog, yeah, I
Yeah,
would think that makes
okay.
sense. Yeah, yeah,
Thank you. That's,
yeah,
yeah, that's
yeah,
fascinating.
yeah, right.
Now, um, in a sermon a couple of weeks ago, I talked about Albert Camus' The Plague, because it seemed like a relevant text for our times, and went back and looked at Father Panelou in that story. People might be familiar with it. It's set in Algeria in 1947 or thereabouts. And this Jesuit priest preaches two sermons. The first one is really about judgment, that he sees the plague as a form of judgment. And the second one, in a sense, modifies that and sees the plague as more of a test. But then in the later part of the novel, Father Panelou joins the care providers and actually dies himself, having caught, well, it's not quite clear whether he's caught the plague or not, but he certainly dies as a result of his effort. So it shows a really interesting trajectory from a pretty uncompromising God in his first sermon,
Right.
and then a more ambivalent God about the test. I'm mentioning that because you've kind of you've kind of invited that question by referring in some senses to judgment and test in your comments about commodities and so on.
Yeah. Yeah.
How do you reflect on that, that way of thinking, or on Camus' book?
Well, I think it's a wake-up call for how we do theology, and I think as you know very well, so much theology is abstract and remote and lacking in imagination, and I think that good theology has to resist generalizations and always stick with the specificity of the narrative. So the Bible is essentially a collage of specific articulations, and then we arrange them it's almost like a Rorschach test, I suppose. We arrange them to arrive at some place where we think we can live for a while. So I don't think in those sermons by Camus' priest that the second one replaces the first one. They are just tugging at our identity and our imagination, and we are always arriving at a new articulation of who we are and how we want to be. So I think it's a very open kind of process. And my impression is that you're so good at that, so that every time you get up to preach, you reconfigure it all in a fresh way. And I
that's
think
kind of you say so.
And
I guess that's what I'm trying to do.
I think that's our work. Yeah.
Can we talk a bit more about the relationship versus commodity issue? I still want to see a bit more beard, if that's all right.
Oh.
Yeah, that's better. Yeah. It's wonderful because the sort of sweater you're wearing looks a little bit like the sort of scrubs that the people wear in the emergency room. So it gives a sort of authenticity. You've just come straight from serving the sick world.
You can clap for me.
It looks great. Yeah, no, we'll clap for you at the end. Don't worry. So yeah, but you just stay back on the. Yeah, that's great. Excellent. Then we get to see the whole of you. Could you reflect a bit on the poignancy that and the paradox and the irony that we're discovering that relationships are the most important thing precisely at the moment when the number of people we're allowed to touch is very, very, very much shrunk.
Yes.
And so what, given the experience we're having now, and many of us are now spending quite a bit of our days in an experience like this.
Yes.
What does relationship without touch and a kind of ambiguous kind of presence, what does that mean?
I hadn't really thought of it, that the without touch part.
I suppose I'm thinking of whether perhaps Eucharistic theology has been wrestling with this for some centuries, in a sense,
right.
of to what extent we touch God in the sacrament,
Yeah.
or not, to what extent God is present or absent or both at the same time. I just wonder if you could explore some of those.
Well, so the non-liturgical churches in the U.S. are having a debate about whether you can do the Eucharist online over television.
Yeah.
Actually, that's a piece of that. So I think that obviously touch is very important to relationality, but it's much thicker than that. And it has many other dimensions of seeing and hearing and remembering and hoping. So it's interesting about how many people are going to retirement homes and nursing homes and touching the window of their loved ones, but there's a glass between their hands.
Right.
They imagine touching each other, and so we do all of that. And my accent on that, however we do that relationship, it turns out to be so much more interesting and so much more important than simply acquiring more consumer commodities.
Yeah.
And so that in some ways that's the great debate in the United States about when to open up the economy is really an argument about the relative importance of relationships or commodities. And our president has no capacity for relationship at all. So he represents the extreme articulation that life consists in commodities and so on, which may sound like a strange replay of Margaret Thatcher about market and society in some ways, I reckon. So
I'd like to tie together that presence and absence in the sacrament kind of territory and what you were saying about touching the glass in the hospital and those kind of things, with what you were talking about earlier in terms of being God-forsaken now, being God-forsaken in the exile, or the balance between whether we actually are God-forsaken or whether we just feel God, I shouldn't say just, but whether we feel God-forsaken, and the cry of dereliction on the cross, it seems the natural place to go then. Is there a triangle between exile, cross, and coronavirus in some way, in the sense that they all are in some significant way about that same God-forsakenness?
I think so. I think that's how I want to read it. And obviously the cross is a replay of exile in some important ways. So I would take that triangle. Yes, right.
And so I'm thinking about the passage in 1 Peter 4 or 5, where it talks about rejoicing in our sufferings because we know that if we share in Christ's cross, then we will naturally share in Christ's resurrection.
Yeah.
Would you think that passage, in the light of what we've just been saying about that triangle from exile to cross to virus, is a particularly significant passage now, in the sense that we are entering into that God-forsakenness?
Yes, I would say so. But I would say the same about these God-forsaken texts in the Old Testament. They are written with the conviction of homecoming and restoration, so that and with the cross, of course, it's Easter, so that it seems to me that biblical honesty is always in the presence of biblical hope. So it's not just honesty that is a cul-de-sac, but it always is toward some kind of new well-being.
So, and I wonder if we could pursue that line then and think about Israel before, during, and after exile, and how when Israel came back from exile, it's not the same. And in some ways, it's not the same in bad ways, and in some ways, it's not the same in good ways.
Yep.
That actually the sense of Israel, who initially without the temple, although I'd be interested to have your reflections on how significant it is they wanted the temple back as quickly as they could. You see where I'm going with this. I mean, it you know, that there's a sense of whenever this period comes to an end, whether it's 6 months or 3 years or who knows, that there is that we're not going to, you know, words like going back to normal maybe aren't appropriate. Maybe this is the prophetic moment in which we get to reset the dial for what normal is.
I think that's right. And while Judaism after the exile was multifaceted, the dominant tradition is the rabbinic tradition of textual interpretation and Torah teaching. So the ambitions of a restored monarchy or restored temple were certainly operative, but they were not the dominant tradition. So that's a real shifting of gears away from temple and monarchy to Torah teaching. And I would think that if you factor that out analogically, you would say that restoration in the United States is not the ambition of being the dominant military superpower in the world, but maybe there are other trajectories that need to command our restored sense of identity and well-being, because there's going to be a great pressure to recover all of that.
So do you think there's an opportunity to read those third Isaiah passages, particularly the ones about you know, building vineyards and everybody having their own acre? I can't remember the exact details, but I'm sure you do. In a way that we haven't read before, or possibly since the end of the Second World War, or at the end of an era quite like that, because, you know, at the end of the Vietnam War, America went straight into Watergate and was in even more trouble than it was before. So it never kind of got to the end of something.
Right.
But do you see that there's an opportunity now to look at those Isaiah 65 type passages and say,
right.
So could you say a bit more, though, about the rights and wrongs of going back to building a temple? I mean, I'm just captivated by that obsession that Israel had, that we're going to get back to Jerusalem and we're going to build a temple again, and the analogy between that
I think
and the current determination to get back to going to soccer matches again, to get back to going to, you know, to doing all the kind of the ordinary things that we filled our lives up with before.
Right. I think that the temple represents a quest for certitude. I think the monarchy represents a quest for domination. And I think it is up to people who are grounded in the Torah tradition, like us, to make the case that neither certitude nor domination issues into entry into the kingdom of God. So the question is whether we have the resources and the courage and the imagination to articulate alternative notions of normalcy that can enter into the political conversation.
And besides, go on.
I just think it will take great resolve, not just to assume that we ought to return to the old normals. Great intentionality. Yeah.
And so you've referred to resources. Besides, I've mentioned Third Isaiah. Would there be other places that you'd go, particularly in, I'm not, no disrespect to anyone on this call, but in parts of the Old Testament that people, haven't read intensely, since their 20s, maybe?
Yes. And then they weren't paying any attention.
Well, I couldn't possibly comment.
Well, I think while it's very complex, we could pay close attention to the Ezra Nehemiah texts. Some of that's not so good.
Some of that, I was going to say, that wasn't the obvious place I thought of, but
but it's a place to look. And I think Deuteronomy probably becomes a trajectory for the kinds of obedience that are appropriate in a society that imagines itself as a neighborhood. So I think it is a pivot on the neighborhood that becomes the center of our ethic.
Okay, so I think we've got two sort of strands again emerging now. First of all is when God's mind is changed, when God's, it is not so much in the absence mode or the mode that can be taken as absence, how does that change come about? Is that something that we can, does our lament, does our intercession have a bearing on that? Or is that we're into Job territory and God's will is so inscrutable that you shrug your shoulders and say, whatever?
Well, I think if our prayer life with God is an actual transaction with someone who is on the other end of the transaction, then we have an obligation to insist that God must embrace God's best self, which is an odd way to talk. But then it's also the case that we urge that the government must embrace its best self, and so on and so on and so on. So it is, I use the word summons in the title of my little book. It is a summons to reconsider and reposition and redefine and recharacterize. And I think that's going to be our work.
So that's the God part of it, if you like. But then the other part of it is how we act, not in relation to God, but in relation to our society. What are the forms of solidarity? Who is it that Christians should assume themselves to be in solidarity with? And how has this crisis focused that question? Is it a tikkun olam sort of repairers of the breach kind of a time? How would you reflect on the calling of Christians in this?
Well, in the United States, I think it's very different in Britain, but in the United States, it has to do with the redistribution of our common wealth. And that has to do with tax policy and all the things that are related. And in order to get at that, that requires organizing to mobilize political energy. So I think acts of neighborly charity are important, but we are tempted to think that acts of neighborly charity are enough, and we really need to address the common good of the political enterprise. And I think that's a Christian thing to be working at.
And it strikes me, it's a paradox. I mean, at the moment, if you listen to some of the more thoughtful broadcasts or podcasts or TV or whatever, people are saying, well, this is such an interesting moment because government is having to reflect on what the common good is and how that balances between health and wealth, as they're sometimes called, or, you know, medical issues or economics. And I always want to say at the end of that, as in, isn't that what government is always about? When did why did the virus just create? That's what government is always about. It's about balancing these different interests.
Yes.
And the curious thing about the UK at the moment is that a conservative government has legislated things that were beyond the socialist dreams. Even as recently as the December election, Labour were laughed out of court for suggesting policies much more mild than what everybody is now assuming is normal for a conservative government to do. There's a kind of way in which we've become a better country in the midst of,
right.
I mean, when I say we become a better country, this sense that we have to care for one another. We can't leave homeless on the streets because they'll infect each other and lots of other people. Okay, the motivation isn't always perfect,
right?
But the outcome is quite significant.
Yes.
So, you know, it strikes me one of the great issues, obviously we do a lot of work with homeless people at St. Martin's, and one of the issues we've been talking about quite intensely is this unique moment. Now, certainly not 100%, but shall we say 85% of homeless people, that's to say street homeless people, are in some kind of accommodation, hotels that aren't being used by tourists or whatever it might be. Yeah. What a unique moment to make sure they never go back to the streets. They're given options.
Exactly so. Well, you are obviously much further along in Britain than we are about those matters here. It's very much in our news that some public person in Britain said that the healthcare program is the new Anglican Church.
Oh yeah,
and we have no parallel to that at all, so we are much harder work to do here than I think you have about that.
Now, could I take you to Jesus's ministry, because, you know, Tom Wright, for example, characterizes Jesus's ministry as calling people home from exile, you know, in terms of rounding up the outcasts, whether they're lepers or whether they're the hemorrhaging woman or you know, of all different shapes and sizes.
Right.
If this period is in some ways appropriately characterized as exile or God-forsakenness, as you put it, is that, you know, are there resources there in looking at the Gospels of Jesus's ministry that are helpful in terms of understanding where the church is called to be today?
I think that's exactly pertinent. That by his narrative engagement with particular persons, he obviously critiqued the entire system and led people to imagine an alternative way of being society, which I suppose is what got him executed. But I have no doubt that's what his ministry is about. And so he contrasts the kingdom of God with the kingdom of Rome, which was essentially predatory. I think all of his actions are actions of resistance and alternative.
So how does this become a global conversation rather? Because it seems to me that what's unique about the virus is that you can think of suffering as being, you know, stuff that just happens, and you can think of suffering as being a second kind of suffering is stuff that we have some implication in,
right.
and then there's another kind of suffering which is just malice, and then there's perhaps a fourth kind of suffering which we, as martyrs, in a sense, consent to undergo for a greater good, if you think of maybe four kinds of suffering like that. what's unique about today is that this doesn't fit neatly into any of those categories. It's a kind of alternative to category one. Stuff hasn't just happened to one person, like contracting cancer or something.
Right.
It's happened to the whole world.
Right.
And so I know, obviously you've characterized your remarks in the light of North America, particularly United States, particularly under this regime. But what does that mean for solidarity with peoples, the world over? I have some friends in Malawi who wrote and said there isn't a single ventilator in the whole country.
Right.
It's the imbalances and inequalities are just overwhelming. And as somebody pointed out on the chat, we didn't get so excited about Ebola because it didn't, just as it wasn't really feminism or Martin Luther King that radicalized 60s America, it was middle-class boys getting the draft.
Right.
In a sense, we've now got concerned about global inequality because it's affecting us too.
Right. That's right. That's right. Well, I can only say obvious things, and that is that people in the United States have to move beyond our treasured notion of exceptionalism to see that we are a member of the international community, and with our great resources, we have responsibility in the international community. And you may have noticed that what has happened in the United States is that our different states have been willing to share ventilators with other states. So it can be done.
Astonishing.
It is astonishing. And so on larger scale, we obviously need to think the same way about the resources that the developed countries have in hand, and what that means for all of us who are in this together. That's very un-American thinking, but very urgent.
Yeah, it strikes me. I wonder if you could reflect on the uniqueness of Israel and the covenant with Israel in terms of, we're the only one that count, in the light of this rather alarming but also absurd sense that each country has to sort it out for themselves, which is, the virus doesn't respect borders, clearly.
That's right.
It's an absurd time to be closing down and just thinking about our own different. But that's clearly happened. We've national sovereignty has become, even in the United Kingdom, we're now apparently trying to treat this as a different issue in Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and England, which given that some people cross those borders to go to work each day.
Right.
And yet when people, particularly historically, when the Bible was more part of everyday discourse, developed these nationalistic tendencies, they would often quote the Old Testament in their defense. Could you reflect on that, rather difficult aspect? Because you've referred to the problem with the supersessionism that feels we've got beyond all that, and how anti-Semitic that can sometimes be. But it's a difficult area, isn't it?
It's very difficult. I think that while the main claim of the Old Testament is that Israel is God's chosen people, there is also in the Old Testament an uneasiness with that, and an awareness that the God who chose Israel has also chosen many other peoples. So the notion of being the chosen people is an acute one in the United States, and it has to be vigorously combated to see that God chooses many people, and there are many chosen peoples, and we have no particular advantage about that. So that requires a very different self-understanding, and it requires, I think, very vigorous teaching. And I suppose that some of that has to do with white people being the chosen people, and Western people being, and you just go on down the line with all of our privileges and our entitlements.
Could you say, well, I could hear you saying, I've never heard you say, but I can imagine you saying that the Beatitudes are a kind of a vigorous commentary on Genesis 12, that they open out the notion of blessedness to the groups that people haven't previously thought as being blessed.
I wish I had thought to say that. I think that's exactly right. Yes.
But that I mean, in terms of your sense of a lot of, there's a lot of blessing. There's
right.
more blessing to go round than Israel can contain in its own life.
That's right. There is an extraordinary passage at the end of Isaiah 19 where God says, "Blessed be Israel, my people. Blessed be Egypt, and blessed be Assyria, my people." So he identifies 3 blessed chosen peoples. It's just one.
And
little
where is that? Say that again. Where that is?
End of Isaiah 19.
Okay.
It's an extraordinary text. Yeah. So it's
Amos also. Some of that Claire is pointing out.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. And the text that I like so much about Isaiah 2 about plowshares and swords and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Micah adds a verse that says, "We will walk with the other nations. We will each walk in the name of our God," which is a recognition of incredible pluralism. And there is that little verse that didn't make Isaiah, but it made Micah. Yeah, right.
Fantastic. So Tricia just asked me to say again that point about the Beatitudes being a kind of a reworking of the notion of blessing from Abraham to make it more explicitly about those who mourn and those who are hungry and so on. Now, this is a personal thing, Walter, but you're coming up for your 30th birthday.
Yes.
Or I know it's a bit more than 21 anyway. I've slightly lost count, but there's a serious possibility you could spend the rest of your days in lockdown or some version of it. Certainly, if you were in this country, we'd say that because you were over 29, you were never allowed to go outside ever again, because that's more or less what we're saying. Could you, a lot of people have been focusing, or had perhaps more leisure to spend more time reflecting on death during this period, particularly those obviously who have conditions that would make getting the virus, very, very serious for them.
Right.
Could you give us some thoughts about death? I don't remember you writing a meditation on "I am a thousand winds that blow."
Yep.
And I don't remember exactly what part of the Apocrypha that's in, actually, or even I've only passed into the next room.
Yep.
How do you think about approaching death, and what does the sure and certain hope of resurrection mean to you?
Well, I have a very vigorous conviction that the God of life will prevail, and I have a very minimal conviction about everything else. So my standard certitude is that my death will not interrupt God's being God, and God will continue to be the God of mercy and justice and compassion and all that good stuff. And I don't think much more than that. So my destiny, however that is, will leave me knowing about the God of mercy.
Will you go into a second edition?
I have no idea about that. I don't think about that. I don't worry about it.
Mm. You know, I was asked a question on one of these, you know, podcast things the other day. What's the most important verse in the Bible? And it was asked by the kind of person who thinks they already know what you're supposed to say.
Right.
And I said it was Song of Songs, set me as a seal upon your heart, for love is strong as death. Because I feel the whole Bible's in that verse.
Yeah.
Really, I think my answer to the question would be, I want to know, and I believe that I'm set as a seal upon God's heart, and on the cross I see that I'm a seal upon Christ's arm, and that tells me that love is stronger than death.
Yep.
And I guess that's a different way of saying what you just said.
I think it comes very close to being parallel statements. Yeah.
But Song of Songs hasn't got, prime billing. I mean, it's not John 3:16, is it?
That's right. That's right.
Do you think it's time for a rehabilitation?
Indeed, I do. Yeah. And I think in general, as we've talked about, this crisis may permit us to notice all kinds of texts that never made the lectionary or whatever. Yeah, right. Yep.
If you were to look back, if you were from your now 29 years, if you were to look back in 50 years' time on this lockdown period, whatever we call it, and were to say, this was the time when God showed us this, or this is the time as the people of God, we began to realize, how would you finish that sentence?
I think I would say we began to realize our proper position vis-a-vis God, that combats both our enormous pride and our compelling despair, and a lively interactionist covenant permits us to resist both pride and despair. And I think we have a chance of seeing that clearly in this crisis.
Well, thank you, Walter. That hour just went past in no time. I wish we could go on longer. We promised everyone we'd stop at an hour. I want to tell everybody one thing that you don't know, which is that on June the 11th, the second Thursday in June, at this same time, and I won't say what time it is because it's different in different parts of the world where people are tuning in, we're going to be talking to Walter's very good friend, John McKnight, the founder of ABCD, Asset-Based Community Development. And I know you're great friends, and he's even older than you are, I think it's true to say, isn't it?
That's right.
Yeah, no, he's as old as time. So, but like you, he's a prophetic voice for our times. And the best compliment I can pay John is to say I would look forward to talking to him almost as much as talking to you. Walter, you've been very, very generous with your time. And I have no idea how many people are on the call, but I know it's, in the 200 plus region. So an awful lot of people will have benefited from listening to you. And I've certainly enjoyed our conversation.
It's been wonderful to get to be with you. And my love to Joe.
Thank you very much indeed. I'll pass that on.
Thank you.
And to Tia at your end. So all the best. And thanks to everyone for joining us. And we'll stop there.
Thank you.
Great.
Bye.